my parents bought my younger sister a brand new Honda with a massive red bow on the hood for her 16th birthday, telling her she deserved the world, while they handed me a Metro Valley bus pass and told me that standing at a stop in the Ohio cold would build character. What they didn't tell me was that my mother had secretly drained the 529 college savings I'd earned from every early morning shift and weekend double just to pay the insurance and gas for my sister's car. Then she looked me in the eye and said the military would pay for my career anyway, so I didn't need that money. My name is Marissa Terrell. I am 38 years old, and I am a Master Sergeant and Avionics Specialist in the United States Air Force, a woman who spent 20 years maintaining multi-million-dollar aircraft because my own mother decided I wasn't worth the price of a used sedan. I stood on the edge of the lawn in Cuyahoga County, holding a paper plate with a slice of grocery store cake I wasn't eating, watching my younger sister, Sloane, scream with a kind of joy that felt like a frequency I couldn't tune into. My mother, Cynthia, had her phone out before my sister even touched the door handle of that white sedan, the video rolling for an audience of digital friends who only saw the filtered version of our lives. My father, Arthur, a man who spent his life hiding in his HVAC workshop to avoid the sharp edges of my mother's moods, stood behind her with a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. Inside our three-bedroom house on the hill, the math had never added up. But that afternoon in the Ohio autumn, the disparity became a physical weight in my chest. My sister's bedroom had been repainted every 2 years, from lavender to sage to a blush pink she'd found on a Pinterest board, complete with a desk from Pottery Barn Teen and new curtains to match her every whim. My own room still had the same sky blue walls from when I was 12, and the same particle board bookshelf my father had assembled incorrectly so that it leaned perpetually to the left, housing the used textbooks I'd bought with my own money. I think most women who have raised a family in a town like ours know the feeling of keeping your mouth shut at the dinner table. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that saying it costs more than the silence is worth. I had been low maintenance my entire life, a trait my mother praised as a compliment while she used it as a license to overlook me entirely. The week before my junior year, I found a receipt in the kitchen trash for $800, new cheerleading uniforms, warm-ups, and a travel bag for my sister. While that same afternoon, my mother had pulled a face when I asked for $60 for an AP biology textbook that the school didn't cover. She told me the budget was tight that month and asked if I could find it used online, which I did for $18 plus shipping, even though the cover was bent and the pages were stained. I studied that book until the ink faded and I earned a 5 on the exam, while my sister wore those expensive warm-ups exactly once before leaving them at the bottom of her locker for the rest of the semester. But I need to go back to the morning of my own 16th birthday, because that was the day the cracks in our foundation became too large to ignore, even for a girl who had spent years convincing herself that her parents had their reasons. It was a Tuesday in September, and there was no party, no string lights, and no bakery cake with fondant flowers. I came downstairs at 5 in the morning to find an envelope leaning against the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter, tucked between the bananas and a stack of Costco coupons that my mother had been clipping. Inside was a Metro Valley 30-day bus pass and a card with a stock photo of balloons that my father had signed, though the handwriting on the envelope was clearly my mother's. She was pouring coffee into a travel mug, her eyes already fixed on the schedule for the private school where she worked as the administrative director, and she didn't even look up when she told me it was a practical gift. She said I'd thank her later because learning to navigate the world on my own would give me an edge that other girls didn't have, while I just stood there turning the plastic card over in my hands, looking at the cartoon bus logo that seemed designed for a second grader. I took that envelope upstairs and sat on my bed for a long time, listening to the house wake up. The sound of my sister's shower, the rumble of my father's truck in the driveway, and the quiet click of the front door as my mother left for work. I didn't cry because of the bus pass itself. I cried because of the way it was handed to me, like it was a settled matter that I was the kind of daughter who didn't require a celebration. I told myself it didn't matter, a lie I repeated every morning for the next 2 years as I stood at the Route 7 stop at 5:45 in the dark, nodding to a man in a hard hat who was the only person to acknowledge my presence in the world before the sun came up. I carried that silence with me through the winter, through the days when the slush soaked through my sneakers and the wind off the lake felt like it was trying to erase me from the sidewalk. 2 years later, my sister's 16th birthday arrived like a royal coronation, and the silence I'd kept finally met a witness who wasn't willing to look away. My grandmother, Evelyn, a woman who had spent 30 years as a licensed interior designer and knew how to spot a flaw in a room's layout from across the street, was sitting in her usual wicker chair on our porch. She watched the Honda pull into the driveway with its temporary plates and its gleaming white paint, and she watched my sister squeal with a delight that sounded like an indictment of every cold morning I'd spent on a bus bench. My mother was beaming, her phone capturing every second for a post that would soon be captioned, "Our baby girl deserves the world." While I stood near the cooler, clapping when everyone else clapped and telling my sister the car was beautiful. No one asked me how I felt, and no one looked at me long enough to see the exhaustion behind my smile, except for my grandmother. My relationship with my grandmother was built in the quiet spaces my mother didn't care to fill. Evelyn set her coffee down on the side table, her right hand resting on the armrest, with a stillness that usually meant she was making a decision that couldn't be undone. A neighbor, Eleanor Riggs, leaned over and whispered something about whether I had received a bus pass for my 16th, and my grandmother simply nodded, her mouth a thin, steady line. She didn't say anything to my mother that day, and she didn't offer me a sympathetic look that would have felt like a consolation prize. She just watched the way the light hit the new car and then looked at me, and I realized for the first time that she wasn't just seeing the party. She was seeing the 2 years of planning that I didn't know were already in motion. In the months that followed, I built a life out of the scraps my parents left behind, working the early shift at Millstone Coffee every day before school started. The owner, a man who had served in the army and didn't believe in small talk, taught me how to close a register to the penny and how to stock inventory with a level of discipline that my mother would have called low maintenance. But he recognized as a professional standard. I saved every tip in a mason jar and deposited every paycheck into a savings account that my grandmother had helped me set up, a secret cache of $3,000 that I protected with my life. I took the bus to every college interview and every volunteer shift, even when it meant being the only person in a suit sitting next to men coming off the night shift at the water treatment plant. Once, I asked my mother if I could borrow the family van for an internship interview 40 minutes north in Independence, but she barely looked up from her phone as she told me that my sister needed it for cheerleading practice. I took the bus, I arrived 10 minutes late, and I told the woman interviewing me the truth, that I relied on public transit because I didn't have a vehicle of my own. I'll never forget the way she paused, then nodded before telling me I had the spot anyway because she valued someone who knew how to solve a problem without complaining. Every month, I took that same bus to my grandmother's house, where we would sit on her porch with tea and talk about my grades, my job, and my plans for the future. She never mentioned the car, and she never mentioned the way my mother treated me. But the last time I visited before my 18th birthday, she looked at me over the rim of her cup and asked if I had my driver's license. When I told her I did, she just nodded and went back to her murder mystery novel, leaving me with a sense that the ground beneath my feet was finally starting to feel solid. I didn't know what she was planning, but I knew that look in her eyes, the one that said she was already 3 moves ahead of a game my mother didn't even know we were playing. I kept my mouth shut for over 2 decades, carrying the weight of that silence through basic training, through long deployments at Ramstein Air Base, and even through the quiet, disciplined hours I spent as a master sergeant repairing the complex wiring of aircraft. I told myself it was for the sake of the family, that my mother needed the image of perfection more than she needed the truth. And I think most of us who grew up in households that valued the neighborhood's opinion over the reality behind closed doors know exactly what it costs when you choose to be the one who doesn't cause trouble. You become invisible in your own life, at your own dinner table, and for a long time, I actually believed that my silence was a form of strength rather than a slow, agonizing surrender. The winter of my junior year in Cuyahoga County was particularly brutal, the kind of Ohio cold that seems to seep through the soles of your shoes and settle in your marrow. Every morning, I would lace up my Vionic sneakers, the only pair I had that didn't have a hole in the toe, and walk the 3 blocks to the Route 7 stop while the sky was still a bruised purple. I would watch my sister's bedroom light flicker on, knowing she had another hour of warmth before she'd walk out to her Honda, start the engine remotely from the kitchen, and drive to school with the heater on full blast. My mother would be in the kitchen, packing a lunch for my sister with the premium organic snacks she bought during her weekly Target run, while I grabbed a granola bar from a bulk box at the back of the pantry and slipped out the door before anyone could ask me why I looked so tired. I remember one specific Sunday dinner, a ritual my mother guarded with a ferocity that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with social standing. She had made a pot roast that filled the house with a scent of home that felt like a lie, and she was busy telling my father about a conversation she'd had with one of the other parents at the private school. She laughed that high, practiced laugh of hers and mentioned how she'd told everyone that I actually preferred the bus, that I liked the independence it gave me, and that I'd always been the rugged one in the family. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, feeling the heat rise in my neck, thinking about the 45-minute wait in the sleet 2 days prior when the bus had been late and I'd missed my first period class. I stood there in my mind, screaming at her that I didn't prefer the cold, that I didn't like being the only girl at the stop among men in work boots, and that I certainly didn't like knowing my 529 savings account, the one I'd been contributing to since I was 14, was being drained to pay for the premium gas my sister put in her car. But all I did was take a sip of my water and nod when my father looked at me, his eyes quickly darting back to his plate as if he were afraid that meeting my gaze would require him to acknowledge the massive, unfair weight I was carrying. My mother didn't even notice the silence. She just kept talking about the upcoming cheerleading regionals and how the family Costco membership was really paying for itself with all the bulk Gatorade she had to buy for the team. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from watching the person who is supposed to protect you become the one who actively undermines your future. My father, Arthur, was a man of routine and avoidance, a retired HVAC contractor who knew exactly how to fix a broken furnace but had no idea how to repair the fractured trust in his own home. He would spend hours in his workshop in the garage, sorting through brass fittings and copper pipes, the air smelling of solder and old metal, just to avoid being in the same room when my mother started talking about money. He knew about the savings account, and he knew that the $3,000 I'd saved from my shifts at Millstone Coffee was slowly disappearing to cover my sister's lifestyle. But he stayed quiet because he was a coward in a house where cowardice was the easiest path to a peaceful evening. I think most women who raise children during those years, especially during the uncertainty of the recession, understand the pressure to make things look okay even when they aren't. But there is a line between surviving and sacrificing one child to favor the other. My grandmother, Evelyn, was the only one who seemed to understand where that line was drawn. She would come over for those Sunday dinners, sitting at the head of the table in her favorite LL Bean cardigan, her eyes moving between my mother's animated face and my silent one with the precision of an auditor. She didn't say much, but she would often ask me to help her in the kitchen. And for a few minutes, away from the performative joy of the dining room, she would squeeze my hand. One evening, while we were clearing the dessert plates, she noticed the way I was limping slightly, the result of a 2-mile walk in the snow when the bus route had been diverted. And she didn't ask me what happened. She just told me to sit down, pulled a bottle of ibuprofen from her purse, and asked me if I was still planning on applying to Westfield College. When I told her I was, but that the commute was impossible without a car, she didn't offer a platitude or tell me that things would work themselves out. She just looked at my mother, who was busy showing my sister a new pair of boots on a website, and then she looked back at me with a gaze that felt like a silent promise. It was during those months that the unacknowledged sacrifice started to feel less like a burden and more like a badge of office. I was becoming the person I would be in the Air Force, disciplined, observant, and capable of enduring things that would break most people. But I was also becoming a stranger to my own parents, a girl who lived in the same house but operated on a completely different set of rules. My mother would brag to the neighbors about my maturity and my work ethic, using my struggles as a way to make herself look like a successful parent who had raised a grounded daughter, all while she was effectively stealing from my future to fund my sister's present. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be the one to break the fragile peace of my father's retirement, and because I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved my value one more time, my mother would finally see me. I stood at that Route 7 stop in the dark, shivering in a coat that was a size too small, and I told myself that this was the price of being the strong one. I didn't realize then that being strong doesn't mean you have to accept being mistreated, and it certainly doesn't mean you owe your silence to the people who are hurting you. I kept that secret even when I found the bank statement on the kitchen counter by accident, the one that showed the transfer from my 529 account to my mother's primary checking. I stood there in the quiet of the morning, the bananas on the counter starting to turn brown in the autumn air, and I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the Ohio weather. It was the realization that in this house, my dreams were secondary to my sister's convenience, and that my mother had already decided what my life was worth. I didn't confront her that day. I just folded the paper, put it back exactly where I found it, and walked out the door to catch my bus, because the only thing more painful than the betrayal was the thought of hearing her justify it. I took the Route 7 bus all the way to the end of the line that Saturday, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my Air Force hoodie, trying to find a way to breathe that didn't feel like I was inhaling glass. I ended up on my grandmother's porch in the quietest part of Cuyahoga County, a place where the air always smelled like dried cedar and the peppermint tea she brewed in a pot that had been in our family longer than I had been alive. Evelyn Terrell was waiting for me, sitting in her wicker chair with her Kindle Paperwhite, the font turned up to the largest setting because she refused to admit her eyes were tired. And she didn't ask me why I looked like I'd been gutted by a secret I wasn't allowed to tell. She just pushed a plate of Costco lemon shortbread cookies toward me and told me to sit down, her bionic slippers resting on a footstool as she watched the afternoon light turn the Ohio maple trees into pillars of gold. I think most women who have raised a family the way she did, quietly, steadily, without a single complaint, know what it means to reach the end of your life and realize the people you did it for never stopped to ask how you were doing. My grandmother was a retired interior designer, a woman who had spent decades making other people's houses look like homes, and she had a way of seeing through the polished surfaces my mother worked so hard to maintain. She knew that my father, Arthur, was hiding in his workshop to avoid the truth, and she knew that my mother, Cynthia, was using my silence as a currency to buy my sister's happiness. As we sat there on that porch, the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of the kind of unremarkable, ordinary love that never announces itself with a red bow or a Facebook post, but shows up in the way she'd already poured my tea exactly the way I liked it. She sat there in her LL Bean cardigan, looking at the bank statement I'd tucked into my pocket, and for the first time in 18 years, I didn't feel like I had to explain why my heart was gutted. If you think you know what it feels like to watch someone lie about your whole life while you stay quiet, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did. Like and subscribe. Because what my grandmother said next about the property she'd just sold is something I still can't say without my voice shaking. I saw the statement, Evelyn, I whispered, the words feeling heavy and wrong in the crisp autumn air. She's taking the 529 money. She's using the 3 years I spent at Millstone Coffee to pay for Sloane's car insurance because she says I don't need it. My grandmother didn't flinch, and she didn't offer me a hollow apology for my mother's choices. She just reached out and put her hand over mine, her skin like parchment, but her grip as steady as the master sergeant I would eventually become. She told me that some people are so afraid of looking at their own failures that they'll set fire to someone else's future just to keep themselves warm, and that my mother had been doing that to me since the day I was born. We sat there for a long time, watching a neighbor's dog run through the piles of leaves, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known was possible in a world where my own parents were actively working against me. My grandmother started talking about her days in real estate, about the duplex on Birch Street she'd kept as her safety net, and how she'd always believed that paperwork was more permanent than a mother's promises. She didn't tell me what she was planning, but she asked me again if I was still set on Westfield College, and when I told her I was, she just smiled. A small, knowing smile that made me feel like I wasn't just a girl waiting for a bus, but a woman standing on the edge of a much larger life. I think most of us have had a moment at a family table where we looked around and realized something had already changed, that someone who should have been there wasn't, or someone who was there was sitting somewhere they didn't belong, and nobody said a word about it. For me, that moment was every Sunday dinner at my parents' house. But on my grandmother's porch, the table was finally level. She treated me like a person of substance, someone whose dreams had weight and whose hard work deserved more than a character-building lecture from a woman who hadn't stood at a bus stop in 30 years. Before I left to catch the Route 7 back to the house on the hill, my grandmother walked me to the end of her driveway, her LL Bean coat wrapped tight against the evening chill. She told me that being low maintenance didn't mean I deserved to be maintained less, and that the world had a way of rewarding those who knew how to wait for the right move. I watched her walk back to her front door, a woman who had survived the Great Depression and the loss of a husband without ever losing her dignity. And I realized that I didn't need my mother's permission to be proud of myself. I took the bus home that night, sitting near the back and watching the lights of Cuyahoga County flicker past the window. And for the first time, I didn't mind the cold, or the strangers, or the long wait at the transfer station. I had the memory of that peppermint tea and the weight of my grandmother's hand on mine. And I knew that whatever my mother was doing with that savings account, she couldn't take away the person I was becoming. I went into the house quietly, slipping my shoes off so I wouldn't wake my sister, who was probably dreaming of the Honda I was currently funding, and I went to my room to study my used AP biology book until my eyes burned. The next morning, I found my father, Arthur, in the garage, hunched over a broken HVAC unit, the smell of grease and frustration thick in the air. He didn't look up when I walked in, but he asked me if I needed a ride to the bus stop, his voice sounding like it was being pulled through gravel. I told him I was fine, that I'd already learned the route by heart, and I watched his shoulders drop just an inch, a man relieved that his daughter wasn't asking for the one thing he was too afraid to give her. I walked away from that garage and toward the street, knowing that the only person in that house who truly saw me was currently 3 miles away, probably looking at a Toyota dealership brochure and waiting for the exact right moment to change my life. I didn't know then that the Westfield College acceptance letter would arrive in 3 days, or that it would come with a requirement that would finally force my mother to say out loud what she'd been whispering in the dark. I just knew that I was done waiting for a seat at a table that was never meant for me, and that the next time I stood in that driveway, I wouldn't be holding a paper plate. The acceptance letter from Westfield College arrived on a Wednesday, tucked inside our mailbox behind a pile of utility bills and a Costco circular, its thick, cream-colored envelope signaling a milestone that should have been the proudest moment of my young life. I sat on the front porch steps of our house in Cuyahoga County, the Ohio air beginning to bite with the first real threat of winter. And I read the enrollment package 3 times before the reality of the logistics finally settled in my gut. The campus was 40 minutes away by car, but it was miles from the nearest Metro Valley bus stop, and for a girl whose entire world was measured in 30-minute transit intervals and transfer stations, that distance might as well have been an ocean. I knew then that the $3,200 I'd saved from my 5:30 a.m. shifts was no longer just a college fund. It was a survival fund, and that if I didn't find a way to bridge the gap for a used Toyota, the door that had just opened for me would be slammed shut by the very people who claimed to love me. I think most women who have raised a family know this feeling. You see exactly what's happening, you've seen it for years, and you stay quiet because you tell yourself your silence is protecting someone you love, even when that person is the one holding the hammer. I prepared for that Sunday dinner like I was prepping for a master sergeant's briefing, laying out my index cards on the kitchen table with the math for a used Corolla I'd found in the local classifieds. A car that was reliable, unremarkable, and exactly what I needed to ensure I didn't lose my future before it even started. My father, Arthur, was already at the table, his hands still stained with the grease from a morning spent in his HVAC shop, while my sister sat across from him, her eyes glued to her phone as she texted her friends about the Delta flight to Orlando for her upcoming cheerleading nationals. When my mother, Cynthia, finally sat down with a tray of lasagna, the atmosphere in the room shifted, that familiar, suffocating tension returning as I cleared my throat and began to explain that I had most of the money saved and only needed a $1,500 loan to make the commute to Westfield possible. My mother didn't even look up from her plate as she told me that we simply couldn't afford a luxury like that right now, her voice as flat and clinical as a weather report, while she reminded me that my sister's national competition was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that required new uniforms and a travel budget that apparently left no room for her eldest daughter's education. I wanted to scream that a used car for college wasn't a luxury, that the 529 account she'd been draining for my sister's gas money was actually mine. But I learned long ago that logic was a foreign language in a house where my sister's wants were always treated as emergencies. My father just stared at his lasagna, his silence acting as a silent vote of confidence for my mother's cruelty. And as I sat there watching the steam rise from a meal I couldn't stomach, I realized that I wasn't being asked to be low maintenance. I was being asked to be non-existent. I stood there in the hallway 10 minutes later, clutching that acceptance letter while my mother laughed in the other room about a new designer bag she'd seen at Nordstrom. And I felt a coldness that no Ohio winter could ever match. If you've ever had to sit at a table and realize you're the only one who isn't considered a priority, tell me if you think she made the right call, like and subscribe. Because what I found on the family iPad in the bathroom an hour later is the moment I finally stopped waiting for them to love me back. The screen was still unlocked, glowing in the dim light of the bathroom. And my mother had been browsing a car leasing website, comparing the monthly payments on a new hybrid sedan that was several years newer than the Honda my sister already had in the driveway. It wasn't a search for me. It was an upgrade for my sister's college years, a plan being laid out in digital ink while the ink on my own rejection was still wet on the kitchen table. I stood there with my toothbrush still in my hand, the foam on my lips making me look ridiculous in the mirror. But the reflection looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. A girl who was finally realizing that the bus pass wasn't a lesson in character, it was a test of how much I would endure before I finally broke. I think most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know what it means to keep your mouth shut. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that saying it only gives them a chance to turn your pain into a performance of their own victimhood. I set the iPad down and walked back to my room, the sky blue walls and the leaning bookshelf feeling like a prison I'd been told was a sanctuary. And I realized that my mother's budget constraints only existed when my name was on the line item. She was willing to spend billable hours on my sister's social life and my sister's comfort, while my own future was something she expected the military to handle because she'd already decided I wasn't her responsibility. I didn't cry that night. I just sat at my desk and opened my laptop, looking at the Air Force recruitment website for the 10th time that month, the images of avionics specialists and technical crews feeling more like a family than the people sleeping down the hall. My grandmother, Evelyn, was the only one I called, her voice on the other end of the line sounding like a lighthouse in a storm as she told me to stay quiet for just 2 more weeks and to not decline the internship at Wallace & Pratt. She didn't explain why, and she didn't offer to pay for the car, but she spoke with the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who has already seen the end of the story. I sat in the dark of my room, the silence of the house weighing down on me, and I realized that my mother had spent years convincing me that I was the difficult one simply because I had needs that didn't fit into her filtered Facebook reality. I thought about the man at the Route 7 bus stop, the one who nodded at me every morning in the dark, and I realized that he saw more of my worth than the woman who had carried me for 9 months ever would. The next morning, I was back at that stop at 5:45, the slush from a midnight flurry soaking into my sneakers. But I didn't feel the cold as much as I felt the clarity of knowing that I was no longer waiting for a seat at their table. I was building my own, one latte at a time, at Millstone Coffee. And the $3,200 in my account felt like the most honest thing I'd ever owned. As the bus pulled up, its brakes squealing against the icy pavement of Cuyahoga County, I looked back at the house on the hill. The white siding, the decent yard, and the 2 cars in the driveway that I wasn't allowed to touch. And I felt a sense of peace that was almost frightening. My mother thought she was teaching me a lesson in independence, but what she was actually doing was showing me exactly how much I could accomplish without her. I stepped onto the bus and took my usual seat near the back, my heart beating with the kind of steady, disciplined rhythm that would one day make me a master sergeant. And I realized that the countdown to my 18th birthday wasn't just a countdown to adulthood. It was a countdown to the day I would finally be free. The bus rides became a kind of meditation for me during those final weeks before I turned 18, a place where the low hum of the engine and the persistent fog on the glass provided a sanctuary from the high-tension silence of the house on the hill. I would sit there in the dim light of the Ohio morning, my eyes fixed on the suburban landscape of Cuyahoga County blurring past, and I would think about the difference between being needed and being merely tolerated. I watched the calendar on our refrigerator, noticing how the days were marked in my mother's elegant, precise handwriting. Dress fittings for my sister, cheerleading practice, and a bold red circle around the date she needed to book the Delta flight for the Orlando Nationals, while my own upcoming milestone remained a blank white square. Most of us who grew up in families like that know what it means to keep your mouth shut at the dinner table, not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that saying it costs more than the very air you breathe. I stood in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening, watching my mother unload a Target bag full of premium party supplies for an event she hadn't bothered to name, her focus entirely on the aesthetic of the upcoming weekend. I finally asked if we were doing anything for my birthday, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to be, and she didn't even stop folding the decorative tissue paper as she told me we'd do a family dinner on Saturday. She said it would be a simple meal because she was just so exhausted from coordinating the regional logistics for my sister, and I realized then that my entrance into adulthood was being treated as a secondary concern, an inconvenience to be managed between more important appointments. I thought about my sister's 16th birthday 2 years ago, the bakery cake with the intricate fondant flowers, the professional string lights my father hung until his fingers were numb from the September chill, and the white Honda that seemed to mock every mile I'd spent on public transit. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be the one to cause a scene before I had my enrollment for Westfield College finalized, and because I was beginning to realize that my mother's neglect wasn't an oversight, it was a choice she made every single morning. The internship at Wallace & Pratt was supposed to start in June, and every time I looked at the confirmation form on my laptop, I felt a surge of adrenaline followed by the crushing weight of the mode of transportation question that I still couldn't answer. I think most women who have raised a family in a town like ours have had a moment at a family table where we looked around and realized something had already changed, that someone who should have been there wasn't, or someone who was there was sitting somewhere they didn't belong, and nobody said a word about it. For me, that moment was watching my mother plan a 3-day trip to Florida for a cheer competition using the very funds I knew were missing from my 529 account, while she casually suggested I could just carpool with a neighbor I barely knew to get to my first real professional job. I knew my grandmother, Evelyn, was the only one truly holding the line for me, her phone calls coming at odd hours just to check if I'd stayed disciplined, her voice a steady anchor in a house that felt like it was drifting further and further from any sense of justice. I spent my shifts at Millstone Coffee counting out the change for lattes and cappuccinos, my eyes fixed on the digital clock above the pastry case, waiting for the moment I could finally step out from behind the counter and into the life I was building for myself. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from performing the role of the perfect, low-maintenance daughter, while your own mother is actively betting against your success. And I carried that weight with me every time I walked up the driveway past my sister's car. By the time Friday night arrived, the house smelled of the heavy ricotta lasagna my mother always made for events she didn't want to think about, a meal that required little effort but looked substantial enough for a photo. And I watched her set the table for 5, the extra leaf in the middle still tucked away in the dark of the hallway closet. I went to bed that night thinking about the master sergeant I would one day become, a woman who would be trained to never leave a soldier behind. And I realized that the woman sleeping just down the hall had left me behind years ago. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the window frame of my room with its sky blue walls, and I felt a strange, cold clarity that was almost like a relief. I wasn't just turning 18. I was becoming a witness to my own life. And I knew that the dinner tomorrow wouldn't be the end of the story, but the beginning of a reckoning that my mother was completely unprepared for. I didn't know then that Evelyn had already visited the notary and the dealership, or that the nautical blue paint of a certain vehicle was already gleaming under the lights of a lot in Cleveland, waiting for the exact moment the lasagna was served. The morning of my 18th birthday arrived with the kind of uneventful stillness that usually accompanies a Tuesday in Cuyahoga County, with no streamers on the railing and no scent of pancakes drifting up the stairs to mark the day I officially became an adult. I woke up at 5:12 without an alarm, an internal clock already set by 2 years of working the early shift at Millstone Coffee. And I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that was already moving on without me. I heard my father, Arthur, clanking his lunchbox in the kitchen before heading out for a Saturday emergency call. A pipe burst in a new development on the east side. And I heard the shower running in my sister's room as she got ready for a morning cheerleading clinic. I went downstairs to find the kitchen smelling only of old coffee and the floral scent of the dish soap. My mother, Cynthia, used to scrub away the remains of a life she found too messy to acknowledge. There was no card on the table, no special breakfast, just a stack of mail from American Express and a grocery store coupon for OxyClean resting next to the fruit bowl. I think most of us who grew up in families where one child is the sun and the other is just a planet caught in the orbit know what it means to keep your mouth shut. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that your voice only disrupts the image of perfection your mother has spent decades building. I stood there in the quiet of that kitchen, the morning light hitting the white siding of the house across the street, and I realized that I had become an expert at being invisible, a skill that would eventually serve me well in the Air Force, but was currently eroding my soul. My father came through the mudroom in his work boots, smelling of copper and solder, and he paused just long enough to squeeze my shoulder and hand me a plain white envelope. Inside was a stock card with a picture of balloons and a $50 bill, the exact amount he'd given me every year since I was 10. As if the cost of my life hadn't increased, even as my mother was draining thousands from my 529 account. He told me he was proud of me and that my mother had dinner covered. Then he was out the door, his truck rumbling down the driveway before I could even say thank you. By 5 o'clock that evening, the house was filled with the heavy, rich scent of ricotta lasagna, a meal my mother made whenever she wanted to perform the role of a nurturing parent without having to actually ask what I wanted to eat. The grocery store cake sat on the counter, its white frosting and blue script reading, "Happy 18th, Marissa," a generic sentiment that felt like it had been bought in a hurry between a Target run and a hair appointment. I sat at the table and watched my mother set the places, her focus entirely on the placement of the napkins, while she talked about the upcoming national cheer competition in Orlando and how she'd managed to secure Delta Comfort Plus seats for her and my sister. She said it was a necessary expense because my sister needed to be well-rested for the high-stakes performance, and I sat there wondering if she even remembered that the money for those seats had originally been meant for my textbooks at Westfield College. I tried one last time to reach her, to see if there was any part of the woman who raised me that still valued the daughter who didn't scream for attention. I told her that the internship at Wallace & Pratt required a confirmation of reliable transportation by Monday morning, and that I'd found a used Corolla for $4,000 that would solve the problem once and for all. My mother didn't even look up from the lasagna she was slicing as she told me we couldn't afford it, her voice dropping into that familiar, dismissive tone she used for anything that didn't involve my sister's social standing. She said that since I was so independent and rugged, I would surely find a way to make it work. And then she shifted the conversation back to the cost of the cheerleading hotel in Florida, as if my career and my education were just background noise in the story of my sister's success. I looked at my mother across that table, watching her adjust the centerpiece while she completely ignored the fact that she had effectively stolen my future to pay for my sister's hobby. And I felt a coldness in my chest that no Ohio winter could ever match. If you've ever had to sit at a table and realize you're the only one who isn't considered a priority, tell me if you think she made the right call. Like and subscribe. Because the sound of the doorbell ringing 5 minutes later is the moment the 2 years of silence I'd kept finally came to a crashing end. I think most women who have raised a family in a town like ours understand the weight of a Sunday dinner where the truth is the only guest who wasn't invited. I opened the door expecting to see my grandmother, Evelyn, but I found her standing there with a small crowd, my uncle, my aunt, and even the neighbor, Eleanor Riggs, who had been a witness to the bus pass humiliation 2 years ago. My grandmother was wearing her best emerald blouse, the one she saved for church and funerals, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that usually meant she was about to close a deal that no one else saw coming. She stepped into the house without waiting for an invitation, her bionic heels clicking on the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, disciplined sound that made my mother freeze in the middle of the kitchen. My mother's face cycled through surprise, confusion, and a sharp, hidden alarm as she realized that her simple family dinner had just been turned into a public assembly. My grandmother didn't bring a gift bag or a card. She brought witnesses to a reckoning that had been 23 months in the making. As we sat around that extended table, the air thick with the smell of lasagna and the unsaid greetings of 2 decades, the conversation turned to the inevitable question of what I'd received for my 18th. My aunt asked with genuine curiosity what big gift my parents had chosen for such a milestone, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it might crack the foundation of the house. My mother jumped in with her practiced routine, telling everyone that I was low maintenance, and that we were keeping things simple this year because I preferred the independence of the bus. I sat there, a girl who had spent 2 years shivering at the Route 7 stop and watching my savings disappear, and I realized that if I didn't speak now, the version of me my mother had created would be the only one that ever existed. I never said I preferred the bus, I said, my voice steady and clear, the kind of voice I would later use as a master sergeant to command a flight line. The table went dead silent, the sound of a fork hitting a plate echoing through the room like a gunshot. My mother's hand went to her water glass, but she didn't pick it up, her eyes narrowing as she realized that the rugged daughter she had spent years projecting had finally found her own words. My grandmother just sat at the head of the table, her peppermint tea steaming in front of her, letting the silence do the work that she had been planning for since the day of the red bow. She looked at my mother, then at my father, and then she pushed her chair back with a slow, deliberate scrape that signaled the end of the performance and the beginning of the truth. My grandmother, Evelyn, didn't say a word as she walked toward the front door, her Master Sergeant granddaughter following close behind, and the rest of the family trailed us onto the porch like they were participating in a funeral procession they didn't quite understand. The Ohio night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the faint, metallic tang of a coming snow, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the dining room where my mother had just tried to bury my future under a pile of ricotta lasagna. I stood there on the concrete steps, my hands shoved into the pockets of my Air Force flight jacket, and I heard it before I saw it. The low, rhythmic rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine turning onto our quiet suburban street. A flatbed tow truck rounded the corner of Maple Hill, its amber lights flashing in the darkness, and it pulled into our driveway with a slow, mechanical precision that made the neighborhood's perfectly manicured lawns feel suddenly fragile. Evelyn put her hand on my shoulder, her grip firm and steady, and we watched as the driver hopped out and began the hydraulic process of lowering a brand new, nautical blue Toyota 4Runner onto the asphalt, its chrome accents catching the glow of the streetlights like tiny frozen sparks. The temporary tags were still in the window, and the tires were so clean they looked like they'd never touched the ground. A vehicle built for the kind of rugged independence my mother had used as a weapon against me, but never intended for me to actually possess. I think most women who have raised a family in a town like this know the feeling of a moment that splits your life into a before and an after. The kind where the room looks different afterward and the silence that follows is the only honest thing left. I stood there, a girl who had spent 2 years measuring her worth in Metro Valley bus stops, and I realized that my grandmother hadn't just bought me a car. She had purchased a formal acknowledgement of the equity my mother had tried to erase. My mother, Cynthia, stood behind me, still holding her half-empty wine glass, her face a mask of shock that was rapidly dissolving into a sharp, indignant fury as she realized her control over the narrative was slipping through her fingers. She looked at the SUV, then at the Honda parked next to it, a car that suddenly looked small and insignificant, and then she looked at her own mother with a betrayal that was almost physical. She started to speak, her voice reaching for that high, authoritative register she used at the private school. But Evelyn didn't give her the space to perform, simply handing me the laser-etched keys with a small twine-tied tag that read, You were always worth the investment. My father, Arthur, stood in the shadows of the garage, his face unreadable. But I saw the way his hands stayed flat against his thighs, the posture of a man who was finally watching a debt be paid that he had been too afraid to settle himself. Anyone who has watched a parent get older knows how quickly the people around them start making decisions as if that parent is no longer in the room, assuming their silence is a sign of fading relatorel rather than a choice to wait for the right moment to act. Evelyn looked at my mother and told her, in a voice that carried the weight of 30 years in real estate and a lifetime of keeping her mouth shut, that she knew exactly what had happened to my 529 account. She said she had seen the bank transfers. She had seen the way my mother had treated my hard work as a communal resource for my sister's vanity. And she had decided that if my mother was going to steal my college savings, then she was going to use her own Birch Street duplex money to buy me the freedom my mother had tried to deny me. My mother flinched as if she'd been struck, the wine in her glass sloshing over the rim and staining her sleeve. And for the first time in my 18 years, I saw her without a script to follow. Just a woman standing in the Ohio cold, forced to look at the daughter she had tried so hard to make invisible. The tow truck driver handed me a clipboard, his expression neutral as if he delivered justice to suburban driveways every Tuesday night. And as I signed my name for the first time as a legal adult, I felt a surge of adrenaline that was almost frightening. My sister stood in the doorway, her phone half raised as if she were about to record a video for Instagram. But she slowly lowered it, her eyes fixed on the forerunner and then on the bus pass I knew was still tucked into my wallet. The disparity between us was no longer something we had to pretend didn't exist. It was parked in the driveway in nautical blue and white Honda paint, a permanent record of the choices my mother had made and the one choice my grandmother had made to undo them. I didn't feel a sense of revenge, but I felt a profound sense of relief, a loosening of the knot that had been tightening in my chest since the morning of my 16th birthday when I found an envelope between the bananas and the coupons. I turned those keys over in my hand, feeling the weight of the metal and the promise of the road ahead, knowing that tomorrow morning I wouldn't be standing in the dark waiting for a bus that was never going to take me where I needed to go. If you've ever had someone in your family who sees you, really sees you, when nobody else does, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did, like and subscribe. Because the conversation my mother tried to have with me in the kitchen an hour later is the reason I know that some wounds never really heal, even with a new car in the driveway. My grandmother didn't stay for coffee or for the grocery store cake that was still sitting on the counter like a forgotten prop. She just kissed my cheek and told me she'd see me for tea on Saturday. I watched her taillights fade into the Cuyahoga County night, and I realized that she had given me more than a vehicle. She had given me back the dignity that my mother had spent years trying to erode. I climbed into the driver's seat of the Toyota, the new car smell hitting me like a physical greeting. And I sat there in the quiet of the cabin, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I looked at the house, the white siding, the glowing windows, the family dinner that was now a wreckage of lasagna and lies, and I knew that even though I was sleeping under that roof tonight, I was already gone. I walked back into that kitchen in Cuyahoga County with the keys to my own life heavy in my pocket, and the silence that met me was thicker than the humidity before an Ohio thunderstorm. My mother, Cynthia, was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a new mug, her eyes fixed on the remaining lasagna, as if she could somehow reorganize the layers of the past 20 years as easily as she rearranged a guest list. She didn't look up when I entered, but the air in the room was charged with a sharp, clinical desperation, the kind of atmosphere I would later recognize in the high-stakes debriefings of my Air Force career where someone has clearly failed their objective and is looking for a way to shift the blame. My father, Arthur, was standing by the sink, his back to us as he meticulously dried a single plate, his shoulders hunched in that familiar posture of a man who hoped that if he stayed quiet enough, he could become part of the drywall. I think most women who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know exactly what it costs when you make that calculation. The price is always paid in the currency of your own truth, and the interest on that debt accumulates until you can no longer afford to live in your own skin. I stood there near the doorway, a 38-year-old master sergeant looking back at the 18-year-old girl who had been told she wasn't worth the price of a car. And I realized that my mother's biggest fear wasn't that she'd hurt me. It was that the neighborhood was finally going to see the equity she'd stolen from me. She finally looked up, her voice dropping into that low, trembling register she used whenever she was about to perform the role of the wounded martyr. And she asked me how I could let my grandmother humiliate her in her own driveway. She said that Evelyn was overstepping, that she was trying to make her look like a terrible mother, and that the car was a weapon designed to tear our family apart rather than a gift for my future. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't reach for the anger that had been simmering in my gut since the morning I found the 529 account statement between the bananas and the coupons. I simply told her that no one had made her look like anything she hadn't already chosen to be. I told her that the rugged daughter she had spent years bragging about to the neighbors was actually just a girl she had forced into a survival mode so she could fund my sister's vanity with my savings. My father finally turned around, the dish towel still in his hand, and he looked at me with an expression that was halfway between pride and profound, agonizing shame. A man who realized that his silence hadn't been a form of neutrality, but a silent endorsement of the betrayal. He tried to tell me that it was complicated, that they were just trying to manage a tight budget during the recession. But I cut through the excuses with the kind of directness I'd learned on a flight line where a single mistake could cost a life. I reminded him that they had 2 cars in the driveway and a savings account meant for my education. Yet they had watched me stand at that Route 7 bus stop in the dark for 2 years while they bought my sister a brand new Honda. I told them that the bus didn't build my character. It built a wall between me and this house that was never going to come down. And that the only reason I was standing there now was because my grandmother was the only person in this family who valued my integrity more than my mother's social image. My sister, Sloane, walked into the kitchen then, her eyes red from a kind of confusion that only comes to someone who has never had to consider where their comfort came from. And she asked if we were still going to have cake. The question was so absurd, so perfectly tone-deaf to the gutted remains of our family dynamic, that I almost laughed, a hollow sound that made my mother flinch as if she'd finally heard the sound of my patience snapping. Most of us have gotten a phone call that split our life into a before and an after, the kind where you sit down without planning to, and afterward the room looks different and you realize you can never go back to being the person who believed in the safety of your own 4 walls. For me, that call was the arrival of that nautical blue truck in the driveway. A loud, diesel-fueled declaration that the version of me they had invented was officially retired. I told my mother that I would be driving to my internship at Wallace & Pratt on Monday morning, and that I would be paying my own insurance and my own gas with the money I'd earned at Millstone Coffee, money that she was no longer allowed to touch. She tried to tell me that I was being ungrateful, that they had provided a roof over my head and food on the table, but I realized then that she truly believed that the bare minimum of parenting was a debt I was supposed to pay back with my entire future. I think most women who have raised a family understand that the most painful thing isn't the betrayal itself, but the realization that the person who betrayed you still thinks they are the victim of your reaction to it. I watched my mother stand up and walk to the sink, her movements stiff and performative, as she told me she needed some time to process my hostility, a word she used to describe the first time I'd ever stood up for my own worth. My father just stood there, looking at the floorboards of a kitchen he'd paid for with HVAC repairs and a lifetime of avoided conversations. And I realized that I couldn't save him from the life he'd chosen any more than I could force my mother to be the person I needed her to be. I left the lasagna on the table, a cold, congealed reminder of a birthday dinner that was never really for me, and I went upstairs to my room with the sky blue walls to start packing my bags for Westfield College. I didn't pack everything. I only took the things I'd bought myself, the books I'd highlighted by lamplight while the rest of the house was sleeping, and the Air Force recruitment brochures that were now my only roadmap out of Cuyahoga County. As I sat on my bed, the leaning bookshelf casting a long, crooked shadow across the floor, I looked at the bus pass in my wallet one last time before tucking it into a box of old receipts. It wasn't a souvenir of a happy time, but a receipt for the 2 years I'd spent being the strong one, a title I was finally ready to resign from. I knew that the next morning, when I started the engine of that 4Runner, I wouldn't just be driving to a job. I would be driving away from a version of myself that had been taught to believe that wanting more was a form of selfishness. I could hear my mother downstairs, her voice finally rising as she started an argument with my father that I knew would last until dawn. But for the first time in my 18 years, the sound didn't make my heart race. It was just background noise to the sound of my own quiet, disciplined freedom. The next morning, the house was draped in that heavy, suffocating stillness that follows a suburban explosion, the kind where nobody wants to be the first one to walk into the kitchen and acknowledge that the furniture of their lives has been rearranged. I carried my duffel bag down the stairs, the weight of it a familiar comfort that reminded me of the master sergeant I would become, a woman who carried everything she needed on her back because she knew better than to rely on anyone else's home ownership or stability. My sister Sloane was sitting at the table in her cheerleading hoodie, staring into a bowl of Cheerios as if the cereal held the answers to why her world suddenly felt so small and lopsided. She looked at me, her eyes red from a night of listening to our parents dismantle 20 years of marriage trust through the drywall. And she asked if I was really leaving for the Westfield dorms early. I told her I had a shift at Millstone Coffee and then a meeting with the Air Force recruiter. And for the first time in our lives, she didn't ask me for a ride or a favor. She just nodded, a girl finally realizing that the Honda in the driveway was a wall she'd been standing behind while I was out in the wind. I think most women who have raised a family understand that the most painful moment isn't when the secret comes out, but when you realize how long the people you loved were willing to let you suffer in the dark. My mother, Cynthia, didn't come out of her room to say goodbye, a final act of performative silence that she used to signal her gutted heart. But I could hear her pacing on the hardwood, the rhythmic sound of her Vionic slippers, a heartbeat of unresolved reputation and standing. I walked out the door and stood in the driveway, the Ohio air smelling of wood smoke and the sharp, clean scent of the nautical blue paint on my Toyota. And I realized that I wasn't waiting for the Route 7 anymore. I started the engine, the low diesel rumble a declaration of presence that made the neighbors' porch lights flicker on in curiosity. And I drove away from that house on the hill without looking in the rearview mirror, because I knew that my grandmother was waiting for me with the one truth I wasn't prepared to hear. I found Evelyn in her garden, her hands protected by heavy leather gloves as she pruned the last of the hydrangeas, the morning frost still clinging to the LL Bean vest she wore over her church clothes. She didn't look up when I pulled into the driveway, but I saw her shoulders drop just an inch, a woman who had been holding her breath for 23 months finally letting it out. We sat on the porch with our tea, the steam rising between us like a confession, and she reached into the pocket of her cardigan to pull out a legal folder that looked too heavy for her thin wrists. She told me that the 4Runner wasn't just a gift from her savings, and it wasn't just a correction for the 529 account betrayal that had gutted my trust in my own mother. She looked me in the eye, her gaze as sharp as a fiduciary duty, and she told me that she had caught my mother trying to forge her signature on a power of attorney to move the Birch Street property into my sister's name, while telling the bank that my grandmother was no longer cognitively capable of managing her own legacy and memory. Anyone who has watched a parent get older knows the quiet fear of being erased from your own life. But my grandmother hadn't been afraid. She had been calculating, a woman who had spent 30 years in real estate and knew that a forged document is void from the moment the pen touches the paper. She told me that she had waited until my 18th birthday to put the car and the remainder of her retirement security into my name, because she knew that my mother couldn't touch what was legally mine. She had sold the family land, the plot in Summit County where my grandfather had planned to build a cabin, because she refused to let my mother turn her dignity in old age into a down payment for my sister's luxury travel lifestyle. It was the SF4 maximum surprise, a revelation that reframed every Sunday dinner and every low-maintenance compliment I'd ever received as a coordinated effort to keep me quiet while they dismantled my grandmother's life work. I sat there on that wicker chair, clutching that legal folder while the reality of my mother's irrational act settled into my bones like a permanent chill. If you've ever had to protect someone you love from the people who were supposed to be their family, tell me if you think she should have spoken up sooner. Like and subscribe. Because what my grandmother told me next about the will she had rewritten in the Cuyahoga County Clerk's office is the reason I never asked for my mother's permission again. I realized then that my grandmother hadn't just saved my education. She had saved herself from becoming another invisible woman in a house full of people who only valued her for what she could leave behind. She told me that the master sergeant I wanted to be was already inside me, a woman who knew how to hold a position even when the world was trying to force her to retreat. We sat there in the Ohio sun, two women who had been underestimated by the same person, and I felt a sense of family unity that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the truth. My grandmother looked at her garden, her eyes reflecting the nautical blue of the car that was now my shield, and she told me that a legacy isn't something you're given, it's something you defend. I drove to my shift at Millstone Coffee that morning with the weight of that folder on the passenger seat, knowing that the girl who took the bus was gone, and the woman who would one day command a flight line was just getting started. 20 years have passed since that Ohio morning, and as I sit here today wearing the stripes of a master sergeant, I realize that the silence I kept wasn't just a shield for my family. It was a prison I'd built for myself out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. I spent 2 decades repairing the most sophisticated electronics in the Air Force, finding a strange comfort in systems where the logic always added up and where a faulty wire was something you fixed, not something you ignored for the sake of appearances. I think most women who have raised a family in a town like Cuyahoga County know what it means to carry a secret that feels like a physical weight in your chest, and how long it stays with you even after you've traded the Metro Valley bus pass for a career of your own. I've lived in base housing from Germany to Texas, but the most difficult terrain I ever navigated was the distance between the kitchen table where my mother sat and the porch where my grandmother waited with the truth. The wreckage of my mother's choices didn't stay confined to our driveway. And in a small community where reputation and standing are the only things people truly value, the truth has a way of working its way through the cracks like a winter frost. My mother, Cynthia, lost her position as the administrative director at the private school when the details of the power of attorney forgery surfaced during a routine audit of my grandmother's estate. She didn't just lose her title, she lost the social trust she had spent 30 years cultivating, finding herself excluded from the very church committees and neighborhood groups that had once been her entire identity. She was left with the congealed remains of a life built on billable hours and false appearances, while my father, Arthur, finally retired from his HVAC shop and moved into a small apartment near the lake. A man who realized too late that his silence had cost him the only daughter who truly understood the value of a hard day's work. My sister became a different person in the fracture, a woman who had to unlearn the dangerous lesson that comfort is something you're owed rather than something you earn. She never got the upgraded sedan my mother had been browsing for on that bathroom iPad, and she eventually traded the Honda for a sensible car she paid for herself while working 2 jobs to put herself through a community college accounting program. My grandmother, Evelyn, lived to see me graduate from my technical training, and she spent her final years sitting on that same porch in her LL Bean cardigan, watching the nautical blue 4Runner pull into her driveway every Saturday without fail. She died with her dignity in old age fully intact, knowing that the legacy and memory of our family was no longer something my mother could auction off to the highest bidder. I think most of us who grew up as the strong one know that the cost of your survival is often the very softness you were never allowed to have. But the fact that I survived it doesn't mean it should have happened. I don't hate my parents anymore, but I've learned that forgiving someone doesn't mean returning to the table where you were starved for affection. I have my coffee on the back porch of my own house now, a home I bought with a VA loan and a lifetime of disciplined saving. And the only sounds I hear are the ones I choose to let in. The birds in the maple trees and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life that belongs entirely to me. Cynthia lost her career, her Birch Street rental income, and the standing she sacrificed her children to maintain. I recovered my savings, my military career, and the knowledge that my grandmother believed I was worth every sacrifice she made. My mother paid with her entire identity for a car that ended up in a junkyard 10 years ago, while I'm still standing. I realized that my mother wasn't just cruel, she was a woman so afraid of her own invisible fears that she tried to make me disappear to feel significant. I drive my 4Runner past the Route 7 bus stop every time I visit home, and I no longer feel the cold. I have my coffee on the back porch every morning now, and the only sounds I hear are the ones I choose to let in: the birds, the neighbor's dog, the wind in the trees. And I am not afraid of what the phone might say. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and like and subscribe. Because there is always someone sitting quietly in a house somewhere right now, holding something painful they have never said out loud, and maybe this is the story that helps them understand they are not alone.